Welcome to this edition of Security and Compliance Weekly. Today we're joined by Evan Schuman, who is a cybersecurity journalist that writes about things like mobile, retail, payments, and cybersecurity. Amongst his many accomplishments, he's also the founder of a column I used to read back, 10, 12 years ago, in the early days of PCI, a little thing called StorefrontBacktalk. We're going to ask Evan his views on many of the topics we like to cover on this show, things like the whole security versus compliance conundrum, the merits and impact of PCI on our industry, breaches large and small, hackers, are they a good thing or a bad thing, marketing campaigns, future trends. Basically, we're looking forward to seeing how he sees the world from a somewhat sort of independent third-party view. I hope you're willing to take that journey with us today as we continue our journey of tearing down silos and building bridges on Security and Compliance Weekly.
This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals. And now, it's the show that bridges the requirements of regulations, compliance, and privacy with those of security. Your trusted source for complying with various mandates, building effective programs, and current compliance news. It's time for Security and Compliance Weekly.
Welcome to episode 96 of Security and Compliance Weekly, recorded on November 23rd, 2021. I am your host, Mr. Jeff Mann. Joining me today are my co-hosts, Ms. Kat Valentine, Mr. Frederick Flea Lee, and we have a special guest co-host today, all the way over from Paul Security Weekly, Mr. Tyler Robinson. Welcome, everyone.
Thanks, Jeff.
Good to see you, Tyler. We're not going to be together tomorrow since there's no show. Since there's a holiday on Thursday. Happy early Thanksgiving, everyone that listens to us from the U.S. Have a couple announcements before we jump into our discussion. First, if you have a specific guest or topic request that you would want us to cover on any of our shows, you can submit these suggestions by going to securityweekly.com/guests, completing the form. We review these suggestions at least monthly, and we'll reach out to you if we are interested in taking you up on your suggestion. Also, I am sorry to have to share this next announcement, but in an overabundance of caution, Security Weekly has decided to flip this year's Security Weekly Unlocked to a virtual format. The safety of our listeners and hosts is always our number one priority, and we're going to miss seeing you all in person, but we hope you can still join us at Security Weekly Unlocked Virtual. The event is now going to take place all on one day. It'll be December 16th. You can still register for the conference and find out all the details and what the format's going to look like by going to securityweekly.com/unlocked. Maybe next year, the world will be normal and we can do this live and in person. Fingers crossed. Anyway, as mentioned in the lead on to the show, our guest today is Mr. Evan Schuman. He's kind of even more old school and a tad more curmudgeon-y than I am, I think. I enjoyed talking to him on our prep call last week. He's so old school, in fact, he doesn't even have a video camera on his laptop. So we're gonna for you podcast listeners, it's not gonna mean a thing if any of you are watching the broadcast. He promises that we're not missing anything by not seeing his lovely face. I think it also might.
Well, I will. I'm gonna push back on that. First of all, okay. You are benefiting from not seeing that, but the absence of the camera is not old school. This is actually a new laptop that I got from Dell like about 3 months ago, and it's just that this particular line, which is a fairly overpriced line, doesn't come with a video camera, which is bizarre, but it doesn't. So. Like that there. And yes, I didn't opt to then go aftermarket because, well, laziness has its advantages.
I accept your explanation. I'm still not convinced that it doesn't have something to do with outstanding warrants or witness protection programs, but we'll take your word for it. Anyway,
yeah, I'm not going to go there.
welcome to Security and Compliance Weekly, Evan. We like to spend a few moments getting to know our guests. So tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, how you got into journalism, and how you ended up focusing on the cybersecurity payments and especially the PCI retail world.
Oh, that's an interesting set of questions. How I got into journalism. I got into journalism at a fairly young age. I started, I was stringing for AP, Reuters, and back when it meant something, UPI, and did a lot of network radio, Mutual, CBS, ABC, NPR in the days. So I started with a fairly traditional journalism background, worked for a variety of daily newspapers throughout, and eventually moved to a business-to-business publishing company called CMP Media back in the day. And that was where I really started focusing on IT issues. The division I was in worked entirely on IT. So that got me started. I'd already covered security back in the dailies from, federal courts and other things, but I really got into cybersecurity then, along with all manner of other IT issues. And eventually, after 11 years, left CMP and moved on and started running my own business, providing content for a bunch of people, and just kept with cybersecurity. It was, it's a fascinating area, and it's our only defense against being destroyed. Not that we won't be anyway, but on the off chance that we somehow survive, cybersecurity will be our ally.
Well, we also like to ask all of our guests what we call the hot seat questions, since we're a show that tries to focus on not only security but also on compliance. And the reason why I even know about you, really, the question is simply, where do you fall on what we like to call the security versus compliance continuum?
Well, that's an easy question for on the security side. Convenience is great at getting people to get involved, but right now we can't afford to reduce security. But I just did a column for Computer World just like about 2 weeks ago, actually November 15th, wasn't that long ago. And it was dealing with Apple and Google, basically when they are doing their transit application. I thought this was fairly cool, that transit has a particular speed requirement. So when they were doing their transit app, which allows you to, pay for subways and trains and whatnot, when they were doing that, they essentially waived almost everything and simply allowed you to connect quickly and pay it instantly, just like you need to, without slowing down the line. Originally, you were to look at it, you were going to look at the phone, do a facial recognition, and go from there. They eliminated a lot of that. And what's happening right now is thieves are stealing the phones, and with the phone off, with power down, it can still make transactions. They just leverage the capabilities that they enabled with their transit app, and huge number of frauds are happening out there because of this hole, which was because they chose to make it convenient. I get why they did, but it's still a very dangerous and reckless decision. So, yes, I'm not a big fan of convenience.
Not a big fan of convenience from a security perspective. I actually was reading that article just a little while ago, and I was interested in it not only because of what you were pointing out is this convenience feature, but also the fact that it had to do with a transit authority. Since I've had in the last couple of years a major transit authority, and trying to help them along, thinking in terms of security when, as you said, convenience and being able to move people through the turnstile is their number one objective. Not quite as big as a metro center is used. I think New York City is an example, but most people get the idea. Tell me a little bit about StorefrontBacktalk, because that's how I first became aware of you. Gosh, I want to say it's been over 10 years ago. used to love the column because you actually focused on, the retail space and the PCI world, which is the world I was living in at the time. And ironically or sadly enough, I'm still living in that world.
Well, let's see. First of all, you referred to Storefront Backtalk as a column, which is interesting because it's not. Storefront Backtalk was a whole publication with stories and features and interviews and Q&As and pieces. And we had, I think it tops 4 columnists. So we did have columns, but Storefront Backtalk was an entire publication. There was a Kindle version. There was a whole, it had a whole variety of lives to it.
I struggle with what to call it because, if it was in print, I would have called it a magazine.
Right.
And then I think we used to for a little while, we called them e-zines, but I'm pretty sure our listening audience probably has never heard that term. So thank you for my.
I opt for media outlet because that's what it was at the time.
Media outlet. Okay. Whatever it was.
Works.
Tell us about it.
Well, basically, I can tell you how it began. It began because I was doing a gig as retail technology editor for Ziff Davis. So I did columns that appeared in at the time, PC eWeek or which had been PC Week beforehand, and PC Magazine and all the Ziff Davis titles at the time. A lot of it has shifted around since then. And I did that for several years. And one of the things was my arrangement with them was to do X amount of content a week. And I found that to do that, to generate that amount of content, I had to generate far more content. I had to dig far deeper, and they only wanted X amount, or at least that's all they were willing to pay for. So over that time, I had a lot more content than they could use. So I ended up creating Storefront Backtalk as a place where I could put all this additional content so people could read it. And that started to grow, and some people wanted to advertise in it and all this. And after several years, it became more lucrative than the Ziff deal. So I ended up leaving Ziff and devoting full time to that. And we brought on staff and all the rest of this. So that's how it came into being. And the big issue at the time was that retail IT, not retail, not IT, but the combination, retail IT was not being aggressively covered. There was only a couple of publications that covered it, and they were doing it very passively. They weren't breaking a lot of stories. It wasn't that kind of a space. So we thought there'd be an opportunity to be able to break stories and to talk to people about what was going on, and to do it with an attitude, to do it aggressively, like we were trying to do it at eWeek, at Ziff. So that was where it began. So we started just by having it be overflow, and then that became more popular than the origins.
Interesting. And I don't remember exactly when I first discovered it and started reading it, but I'm pretty sure it had to do with you had a columnist working for you with you that focused on PCI specifically, a gentleman named Walt Conway. And for our listening audience, I'm sorry,
Conway.
For our listening audience, Walt is no longer with us. He died very, very quickly. I think it was pancreatic cancer. Got the diagnosis and was dead like weeks or months later. It happened very quickly. I think that was back in 2013, if memory serves.
That sounds about right.
And I met him, I think at 1 or 2 PCI community meetings, their annual meetings, and I remember vividly having a discussion with him, sort of in his column, about tokenization, which was very new and up and coming at the time, and people were very excited about tokenization because of the prospect from a convenience angle again of, hey, if it's not card data and it's not encrypted card data, if it's something else, do we really have to do any of this PCI stuff? And I went back and forth with him a little bit on that, and just trying to help him and readers understand that, tokens don't necessarily have zero value from a fraud perspective if they can still be used against you.
Well, let me just say on tokenization and PCI. I mean, I had and have very strong feelings about that. A lot of tokenization, the marketing push behind that involved being out of compliance. Not out of compliance in that you've done something wrong, but that you didn't have to worry about PCI. This took you out of scope, literally. Right. And I was arguing, it doesn't. In other words, any tokenization, if you can return it to its original state, as bad guys tend to have the ability to do, then no, it's in scope. It's theoretically a little bit protected, which is great. But no, out of scope means you don't have the data, you can't get the data, it's completely out of scope. And there were things that were honestly out of scope. They were just fairly rare. I think Square, back in the day, did something which was honestly out of scope. Someone could go into a Square merchant that used this particular program. I believe it was called Cardcase, and I have no idea how I remember that. But the idea was that someone went into like a bar, and instead of giving them the credit card, you would just use the Cardcase to process the payment, and the payment would go to Square, and then Square would handle it. Not that dissimilar to a lot of things today, but they were one of the first. And it actually was out of scope. The merchant never had your card data. Therefore, that was actually out of scope. People thought tokenization did that, and I always argued, no, it really doesn't.
I tend to agree with you. One of my co-hosts, Kat, actually knew Walt as well. Don't want to make this all about Walt, but Kat, do you have any comments at this point?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Shout out to Walt. That was actually my very first year in InfoSec. He kind of stepped up as a mentor of sorts. I worked with him at 403 Labs. And it was my first year in InfoSec, and he encouraged me to write this talk on PCI forensics because I was also taking forensics classes at the time, and it got accepted. And so I asked him if he could please, co-present with me because he was a name in the space and he was used to doing talks, and I am not sure what to do with myself with so far as speaking, and especially like a first year type of thing. And, so he said, sure, I'll do that. I created all this content and whatnot, and he helped me practice it. And when we got there, he said, all right, you got this, but I'll be right here. And he made me do the entire talk by myself. And it was actually pretty good because of the prep he helped me with, And so I just wanted to shout out Walt. He really pushed me when I needed it professionally, and then personally. Anytime he came into town, I was living in Wisconsin at the time. He would come over. I'd invite maybe another coworker or two that were local, and we would do like a homemade lasagna, and instead of like hanging out at the bar kind of a thing. So, shout out to Walt. He was a great soul.
No, I mean he was one of my favorites too. One of the things that he did that I felt was so wonderful. He was a QSA. We haven't actually said that, but he was a QSA at the time, and his column was basically telling retailers, "This is what you do, so people like me don't beat you up. This is what you need to be aware of." But he did it with an attitude, and I remember one of my favorite columns he did was he was talking about the terminology that a lot of people talk about being PCI certified. He said, there is no PCI certified. There is certifiable, which is how I characterize anyone who says they're PCI certified. They're bloody certifiable. But, and that was one of his things. And I just kept that throughout the years and of course, vendors will always say that. And it's like, nope, that's not what they do. But don't get me into a PCI discussion about what PCI actually means, because I will have to use my bad words then.
He totally did the certification thing with me too. He drilled that in my head. It is not a certification, and and all that. And so since that was my first exposure really to PCI was through Walt, and the firm that we worked at, 403 Labs, was really well known at the time for that stuff. Another thing too that he did was worth mentioning, because I think this is impressive, and I was always like, whoa, is he also had like an education blog and he specialized at the firm in doing PCI for universities, which is like making an entire university PCI compliant. It's like making a small city PCI compliant. And he ended up taking me on one of the gigs. He let me shadow and like take notes and just kind of watch what was going on. And he had a really interesting way of divvying that stuff up. And it kind of taught me about scale before AWS was really a thing. Like he was a good guy. And when other people at the firm were just like, no, she should just stick with vulnerabilities and stuff like that, I kind of wanted to be a QSA. And he was like, no, let her do whatever she wants to do. I'm going to take her on a gig. He was awesome. He was like everything. He's everything that most of the men in our scene now should be. And he was just such a kind individual. He really knew his stuff too.
No, absolutely.
Except for tokenization. We disagreed on things.
Well,
but he came around.
we could disagree on a lot of stuff and all that kind of stuff too. Because before I came into information security, I was a VoIP engineer. So it was really nice that any questions that he had about like VoIP call centers and PCI scope, he would come to me, this like 1-year newbie in InfoSec. He was just a great guy. I don't know. You could disagree with him.
Yeah. So I have a question for you, Evan. You've obviously been doing the journalism thing for many, many years. And even though you don't officially do Storefront Backtalk anymore, even with the article that you had just in the last 10 days or so, you're still kind of hovering around the payment space. What do you see your role as being, writing articles about this, pointing out the discrepancies, the irregularities, the peculiarities? What's your goal? What are you trying to accomplish? And who's your intended audience, I guess, is part of the question.
Well, that's a highly customized question. In other words, I have a variety of clients. Some of them are media outlets, including SC Magazine, which is now SC Media. And when I write for them, so their audience are CISOs. When I write for Computer World, their audience are CISOs as well, but they're primarily CIOs and IT directors, all looking at in the Fortune 1000 space. So, and a lot of clients, I do a lot of work for McKinsey. For them, it's C-levels of all kinds, board members of all kinds. So the audience is all dependent on who I'm writing for at that moment. And what's the point, and what are they trying to accomplish? So I'm not sure if that's an answer, but since I work for so many people with so many different environments, it's hard for me to give a one-size-fits-all answer.
No, that's fair. I just think back to what we've been talking about with Walt. He was trying to educate and he was trying to clarify. I mean, you brought up the language issue, and our whole industry, forget payment space and PCI, our whole industry, in my opinion, is full of terminology that very few people can actually agree or have consensus on a definition of just about any of the terms. Is that something that you see from well, let me back up. Is it fair to categorize what you do as a cybersecurity journalist as being somewhat fair and impartial, third party, hopefully taking a sort of a step back, macro look at this peculiar little world that we live in?
Well, I obviously try to be fair and impartial, but a more realistic answer is that I see myself as an advocate for the reader, for the audience. So whatever client I'm working for, that's my biggest pushback point, which is they'll say, let's talk about X. I say, great, let's do that. And we talk about it and saying, yes, but the audience you're targeting already knows that. What's the point? The only way to grab an audience to get them is to tell them something they don't know. Ideally, tell them something that challenges what they think they do know, their understandings, expectations, beliefs, that sort of thing. So I see myself as trying to help the readers understand this issue, the implications, the importance of whatever it is. And I try to do that by focusing on what they don't know. I see far too many companies doing the opposite, where they will put something out and they will say, oh, we just put the blog out on this. And I look at it and going, you got to be bloody kidding me. This is like blindingly obvious to the people you're targeting. Why in the world would they read it? Why in the world would they forward it? This doesn't really advance your objective. So I see myself as a reader advocate, and I still do that, with every client, because I just get a lot of pushback on that, and they want to be blindingly obvious. And I say, that's going to repel readers. It's not going to help. So I'm not sure if that's an answer, but that's sort of the way I look at it.
No, it's absolutely an answer. Flea, Tyler, you guys have been awfully quiet. Any questions?
Yeah, like one of the very first questions I have, I'm actually kind of curious, Evan, like what are the things that actually get you excited to report about? And you kind of mentioned like being a proxy for the actual audience themselves, like you expose them to things that maybe they don't know about. But I'm really curious about what are the things that you personally get excited about? Like what are the kind of stories you want to do a deep dive in to, regardless of the audience? I look for contrarian. I look for someone who, what I'm looking to make the audience do, I first have to sort of make myself do, which means when someone tells me something, and I get pitches all the time, most of them ludicrously off point, but I get, pitches from agencies and all that routinely, and they will call over and they'll say X and Y. And I'm saying, okay, why would I care? What is different about that? What the reaction I'm looking for the audience and for myself is, whoa, now that's an argument I haven't heard anyone make before. That's an insight. It's a different way of looking at it. I've got a very specific definition of insight. An insight is, well, let me give an analogy. You've got 25 data scientists in a room. I know that's a frightening nightmare scenario, but you got 25 data scientists in a room. And one of them gets up and goes to the front of the room and is making an argument and puts out a series of details from some research he's done. And he said, if you look at all these details here and you project it out 5 years, as you can see here on the right, we're looking at a 20% increase 5 years from now. And everyone in the room nods and says, yep, that looks about right. That sounds good. It's consistent, etc. One woman in the back looks at it and says, I disagree. She walks up to the front and saying, the problem here is that you've weighted everything evenly, and you can't do that. So the fact is, these people just made these purchases, so they're not going to buy anything for another 8 years. So we take them out, and this person has not bought for 5 years, so let's weight them heavily. And when you look at it that way, if you look over here, you're looking at a 5% drop, not a 20% increase. And everyone in the room looks at it and said, damn, she's right. That's true. That's an insight. An insight is when a whole bunch of people look at the same data and one person says, no, that doesn't mean that. It means something very different. This is what it means. So that's an insight. It's an insight is looking at the same stuff, but coming up with a different analysis and ideally being right. If your insight is wrong, it's not much of an insight, but that's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for someone to tell me something that I've never heard argued and that ideally challenges what I have heard. And that's what I'm looking for. And it's kind of amorphous, but you know it when you hear it. When you hear it, if you think I've never heard that before, it's a very good start. So that's, I don't know if I get excited about it. I've been doing this too long, but that's what gets me to say there's a story here. There's a story here that should be told. I have a follow-up just because you kind of mentioned the breadth of your tenure. We won't make any age jokes or anything, but I'm actually kind of curious, like somebody who's been in the industry following it and just talking about security in general. Do you feel, like as a journalist from your observations, that security is getting better or is it getting worse? I'm kind of curious, like, what is your feel about the direction that we're going as an industry due to, your job being just covering, like how well we're actually responding to things, what's actually changing, et cetera?
Well, I'm going to give you an answer that's going to sound a lot more optimistic than it will turn out to be. Yes, security is getting better. But I would argue that that's not the question you really want to ask. The question you want to ask is there's a battle going on between security professionals and cyber thieves and cyber terrorists, the quote unquote bad guys. So they're advancing too, and they're advancing very quickly. They've got some serious funding. They've got a lot of wonderful creativity. So are we keeping ahead of them? Are we getting a longer lead on them? And the answer is, I'd say no. So I'd say that we are not materially safer than we were before. Cybersecurity has gotten better, but the bad guys have gotten even better than that. So we're still in the battle, but it's very difficult. I mean, there was a piece I saw the other day, which was a great illustration of what we're up against. And it wasn't a brilliant technological feat. What the bad guys did here was they reached out to a variety of people on mobile texting and said, we see that you just made a $500 transfer to this company, a payment. I think this was focusing initially, they were using Venmo as their argument. And they said, we noticed you made a $5,000 Venmo transaction. Did you do that? And whether they said yes or no, if they responded at all, they'd get a phone call, ostensibly from their bank, and they would use caller ID spoofing, so it would show the name of their bank. They would focus on one bank at a time, and then they would ask you information about it, and they would, while you were doing that, they'd be asking, they wouldn't ask you for your password or anything like that. They would ask you for just some very basic details, enough for them to go on while you're online and ask for a password reset. And as soon as they did that, they said, we're sending you a verification. And indeed, 2 seconds later, miraculously, you'd get a verification email from that bank asking you to verify and saying there's a password reset or whatever it says. And then you would accept it. And they've just changed your password, giving them full control over your account. And there are no alarm bells. Unless you happen to know of the scam, it sounds very convincing. So that's why I mean by that the bad guys have gotten very creative in how they're attacking, in that case, how they're phishing. That's phishing as well, but it's also more malicious activity afterwards. So yeah, cybersecurity is getting better, but the bad guys are getting more creative. And I don't know that cybersecurity professionals are getting more creative. And I think that you have to use your imagination in this business. And I think that could be done far better.
I'm kind of curious as a follow-up to that, like inadvertently as being a journalist, you're also effectively an InfoSec historian. And I'm kind of curious, are you seeing the nature of professionals also change? You kind of mentioned like, hey, we need more creativity. Are you seeing more people actually getting involved? And also, is your audience itself expanding? Like obviously, like decades ago, probably your audience was primarily just, security nerds, right? I'm kind of curious if you're getting a broader audience now because more people are aware, or is it kind of like the same audience?
Well, cybersecurity has these shortages, and I'm putting quotes around shortages because I would argue it's less a shortage than it is a budget differential. In other words, I usually tell companies and countries, saying, we're having a really hard time getting experienced cybersecurity professionals. And I'll ask them what they're offering for a starting salary, and they'll tell me, and I'll say, okay, triple it and come back to me in a week and tell me if you still have a problem. So, of course, they don't, but they don't really triple it. The fact is, they're just not offering enough money for the market. So if you offer an appropriate compensation, there are plenty of experienced cybersecurity professionals out there. So it's not as much of a shortage as it is that their value is higher, and you need to match that. And I think that's where a lot of enterprises, a lot of Fortune 1000 companies drop the ball, and it's not being done at the CISO's office or the CIO's office. It's being done at the CFO's office, CFO, COO, CEO, and at the board, where they're simply not allocating appropriate resources. And therefore, they're always understaffed. They don't have enough people. And if there is an attack,
the insufficient resources make it known. They're saying, well, you didn't stop that attack. It's like, I've been begging you for more money for 2 years. So this is the end result. And they don't get that. So I think there was insufficient cybersecurity investment by almost all of the largest companies. And they're just starting to feel the pain, and they're not connecting the dots. They're thinking, oh, the CISO screwed up. It's like, no, you screwed up when you didn't approve that budget allocation 2 years ago.
Hey, on that note, let's. Sorry, Tyler. I'll let you go first, but we need to take a really quick break, and it's hard to find a break in this conversation. Very riveting, but we'll be right back. Don't go away.